is there are some questions people have been afraid to ask for centuries. Questions that cut deeper than doctrine, that challenge the very foundation of what we've been taught. One of those questions is this: why did Western churches ban the Ethiopian Bible? You see, when you dare to ask questions like that, you're not just digging into history, you're uncovering power structures, lost voices, and uncomfortable truths that many would prefer to stay buried. But if we truly want wisdom, if we want clarity, we must be willing to shine light into the darkest corners of the past. Because in that light we don't find division, we find understanding. And understanding is what sets us free. Now, let's not mistake this for a simple issue of religion. No, this is about control, influence, and who gets to define what is considered divine. The Ethiopian Bible, also known as the Gez Bible, or the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church Canon, is one of the oldest and most complete biblical canons in the world. It contains over 80 books, far more than the 66 most Western Christians are familiar with. It includes books like Enoch, Jubilees, and the Book of the Covenant, texts that speak of heavenly realms, ancient wisdom, spiritual discipline, and even African identity in a divine context. These aren't just extra pages. These are powerful truths that paint a bigger picture of human history, spiritual journey, and divine connection, especially for people who have been historically erased or marginalized. So when we ask, why was it banned, we're not talking about a clerical decision or an academic dispute. We're talking about fear. Fear of what people might discover if they knew that spiritual authority didn't begin in Rome or London, but in places like Axum in the highlands of Ethiopia, where kings walked with priests and scripture was written in a language older than Latin. We're talking about what happens when a system of power realizes that the narrative they've upheld doesn't hold the only truth. Because if people began to read the Ethiopian Bible, if they began to digest its wisdom, they'd realize that the story of God was never owned by any one nation, race, or institution. It was always bigger than that. History shows us that the early Christian church did not begin in the West. It spread from the Middle East and North Africa long before it ever reached the shores of Europe. Ethiopia was one of the first nations in the world to adopt Christianity as a state religion, long before many of the Western powers had even heard the name. The Ethiopian Bible was compiled by scholars and scribes who preserved scriptures that many other traditions either removed or never acknowledged. And it's important to understand those texts were not banned because they were false. They were banned because they were inconvenient. Inconvenient to empires, inconvenient to colonizers, inconvenient to anyone who wanted to place themselves at the center of God's plan while excluding others from the narrative. The banning of the Ethiopian canon wasn't just about theology, it was about politics. It was about shaping a version of Christianity that served the interests of rising Western powers. It was about constructing a religion that could justify conquest, that could turn spiritual practice into social hierarchy. And to do that, they had to simplify the message. They had to trim the scriptures, streamline the doctrine, and remove anything that spoke too loudly about liberation, identity, and divine justice. Books like Enoch, which talk about fallen angels and a different spiritual order, had to go. Books like The Shepherd of Hermas and Jubilees, which emphasize moral responsibility and divine visions, were too complex, too raw, too powerful to control, so they were left out. And the Ethiopian Bible, it was ignored, silenced, because it was a reminder that there was a richer, deeper story that couldn't be controlled. But that silence didn't erase the truth. In the hills of Ethiopia, in monasteries carved into mountains, monks continued to read those scriptures. They copied them by hand, guarded them like treasure, and passed them down through generations, because they knew that truth doesn't disappear just because people refuse to see it. You see, the banning of the Ethiopian Bible is part of a much larger issue. It's the same reason history books in the West often leave out African contributions to science, art, and philosophy. It's the same reason people are taught about European cathedrals, but not about the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela. It's the same reason we hear about Rome and Jerusalem, but not about the ancient city of Axum, where faith, royalty, and scripture were intertwined in a way the world has long forgotten. Western institutions have often dictated what is valid, what is true, what is worthy, and in doing so, they've hidden the spiritual wealth of entire civilizations. But here's what they couldn't do. They couldn't erase the hunger for truth that lives in the human spirit. They couldn't stop people from searching, questioning, and awakening to a broader understanding of their place in this world. And now, that awakening is happening. People are beginning to rediscover what was once suppressed. They're reading the book of Enoch and asking why it's not in their Bible. They're learning about Ethiopian kings who worship the Creator before Europe ever heard the gospel. They're opening their eyes to the truth that faith didn't start in the West. It started with humanity's earliest civilizations, and Africa was not just part of that story. Africa was central to it. To ask why the Ethiopian Bible was banned is to ask who benefits from the erasure of certain truths, who gains when knowledge is removed, who profits when people believe their spiritual history began with colonization instead of with creation. These are hard questions, but they need to be asked, because what we find when we look into the Ethiopian scriptures isn't just theological difference. We find inclusion, we find divine wisdom that speaks to the soul of a people who have been overlooked and undervalued. We find that God's voice has always echoed through the mountains, rivers, and deserts of Africa, and that voice still speaks. Let me tell you something else. When people begin to rediscover these ancient texts, something powerful happens. They begin to see themselves differently. They stop walking with their heads down. They stop believing the lie that they are less than, unworthy, or forgotten. They realize that their ancestors weren't lost. They were leaders. They weren't heathens. They were holy. They had scripture. They had order. They had divine purpose. And once you awaken to that, you can't be controlled the same way anymore. You can't be manipulated by fear or shame, because now you know who you are. You know whose you are, and you know the truth was never theirs to give or take. It was always within you. So yes, the Western churches banned the Ethiopian Bible. But the question now isn't just, why did they ban it? The real question is, what are you going to do with the truth now that you know it? Will you seek more? Will you open your heart to the wisdom that was once hidden? Will you challenge yourself to go beyond tradition, to expand your understanding of the divine? Because the truth doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs a willing heart to receive it. This message is not about division. It's not about blame. It's about awakening. It's about giving voice to the silenced. It's about healing what was broken. And if we're brave enough to look back with open eyes, we can move forward with greater clarity. The Ethiopian Bible wasn't just banned, it was buried beneath centuries of misunderstanding. But now the ground is shifting. The truth is rising. And no power on earth can stop a people who have discovered that their story was sacred all along. So let the world know the story didn't start in Rome. It started in the garden. It moved through the sands of Egypt, the temples of Ethiopia, and the mountains of Zion. The light of truth may have been hidden for a time, but it was never extinguished. And now, in this generation, it's being restored. The question is, will you be part of that restoration? Will you dig deeper? Will you stand for truth even when it's uncomfortable? Because truth doesn't need to shout, it only needs to be heard. And today, if you're listening, you just heard it. Western churches intentionally pushed the Ethiopian Bible to the margins because its presence challenged the dominant narrative they worked hard to build, one that placed Europe at the center of religious authority. For centuries, people were led to believe that spiritual leadership began in Rome or moved through Western civilization like a divine torch being passed from one enlightened nation to another. But the Ethiopian Bible told a different story. It carried within its pages ancient texts, preserved wisdom, and a tradition that began long before the Western world ever embraced Christianity. The Ethiopian Canon, untouched by the doctrinal pruning that occurred in other parts of the world, stood as undeniable evidence that Africa wasn't a side character in the story of faith, it was a foundation. This wasn't merely a disagreement over books, it was about reshaping the image of who holds sacred knowledge. The Ethiopian Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth, didn't look to Rome for validation. It had its own theology, its own scholars, its own deep-rooted scriptures. That independence was unsettling to Western institutions that sought to frame Christianity as their cultural inheritance. The Ethiopian Canon included over 80 books, texts that spoke of divine order, human responsibility, cosmic events, and a spiritual worldview that didn't require approval from European councils. These scriptures weren't added out of novelty, they were maintained because they had always been part of the faith tradition in that region. Their existence wasn't an expansion, it was a continuation of truth that predated many Western theological debates. There was a deliberate effort to minimize these texts because they offered a narrative where Africans were not just participants, but leaders in the spiritual journey of humanity. In these pages were stories of people with dark skin walking with God, of kingdoms built on righteousness, of laws given to guide humanity before Western eyes ever read a word of Scripture. If those texts became widely known, it would force a reckoning with the fact that much of what people thought they knew was shaped by selective storytelling. And that kind of awakening threatened the control that Western churches had over doctrine, over identity, and over the perception of divine favor. What made the Ethiopian Bible particularly dangerous to that system was not that it contradicted the message of love or grace, it was that it added layers of understanding that couldn't be easily controlled. Books like Enoch spoke about the Watchers, angels who descended to earth and altered human destiny. The Book of Jubilees gave detailed chronologies and expanded teachings that connected the spiritual and the historical. The Book of the Covenant emphasized divine justice and personal accountability in a way that didn't allow for passive faith. These weren't fanciful tales, they were foundational truths for millions who followed the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. But because they didn't fit the sanitized, simplified version of Christianity that colonizers wanted to export, they were sidelined. That exclusion wasn't accidental, it was a strategic move to streamline belief in a way that made it easy to package, sell, and enforce. When religion becomes a tool of empire, truth is no longer the priority, uniformity is. And in that pursuit, voices are silenced, histories are erased, and sacred knowledge is buried. But even buried, the truth doesn't lose its power, it waits. In Ethiopian monasteries, carved into mountains and hidden away from political interference, monks preserved these texts. They copied them by hand, passed them down generation after generation, and lived by their teachings with unwavering devotion. They knew that they were guardians of something sacred, something the world wasn't ready to face. Now, as more people awaken to the fullness of history, that light is beginning to shine again. People from all backgrounds are asking why they were never told about these books. They're discovering that faith didn't originate in the stone halls of European cathedrals, but was nurtured in the sun-baked churches of Africa. They're finding out that the spiritual wisdom they were denied might have been the very truth they were seeking all along. This isn't about proving one version right and another wrong. It's about restoring what was lost. It's about recognizing that the spiritual journey is far richer, far deeper, and far more inclusive than we were taught. The Ethiopian Bible stands as a monument to a faith that could not be erased. Its survival is proof that no matter how hard institutions try to reshape history, the truth has a way of rising. And with that truth comes a deeper sense of identity, especially for people whose ancestors were told they had no part in the divine narrative. They were told they were outsiders. But the Ethiopian scriptures say otherwise. They say you were there from the beginning. You were always part of the plan. Your story was never forgotten. It was only hidden. And now that it's being uncovered, the world has a choice to ignore it again or to embrace a more complete understanding of faith, history, and human dignity. The exclusion of the Ethiopian texts from the Western canon wasn't simply a theological decision, it was a deliberate exercise of power. When religion intersects with empire, it often becomes a tool not just of spiritual guidance, but of societal control. Western institutions understood the profound influence of Scripture, not just in shaping personal belief, but in molding collective identity. The Ethiopian Bible, rich in its depth and expansive in its wisdom, presented a threat to the carefully constructed religious narrative that Europe had established, one that served its political ambitions as much as, if not more than, its spiritual needs. By choosing which texts to validate and which to reject, Western powers didn't just shape theology, they shaped history, heritage, and human worth. In the Ethiopian canon, the themes of divine justice, spiritual responsibility, and sacred identity stand tall. These texts emphasize not just the grace of God, but the duty of humanity to walk in truth and righteousness, to be aware of their place in the grand design, and to live lives of accountability. That kind of doctrine is dangerous to any system that depends on submission without question. When people are given access to spiritual writings that empower the individual, that connect them directly to the divine without the need for intermediaries, and that speak to their personal value in the eyes of eternity, it becomes difficult to manipulate them. The Ethiopian texts didn't offer a diluted or passive faith. They presented a faith that demanded awareness, action, and inner transformation. By removing these writings, Western institutions were able to present a version of religion that emphasized obedience over understanding. In doing so, they controlled not just what people believed, but how deeply they were allowed to question, search, and discover. This control was especially necessary when justifying systems of oppression like colonization and slavery. If the full story were told, if Africans knew their central role in the earliest days of the faith, if they were aware that Scripture had long lived and thrived in their own lands before it was ever exported by European missionaries, then the foundation of colonization would begin to crack. Power can only sustain itself when the truth is hidden, and that's precisely what happened. The Ethiopian Bible was not just excluded, it was concealed from the masses, buried beneath centuries of selective storytelling and theological editing. The shaping of Christian doctrine in the West was not an innocent process. Councils were held, not always in pursuit of truth, but often in pursuit of consensus and control. Books were removed not because they lacked spiritual insight, but because they challenged the narrative that Rome, or later Western Europe, was the final authority on divine revelation. The Ethiopian church, by contrast, didn't participate in this streamlining. It held on to texts that predated these councils, preserving a fuller picture of the early Christian worldview. Those texts were full of spiritual depth. Books like Enoch, with its warnings and revelations about the fall of angels, Jubilees, with its detailed recounting of divine order, and the Book of the Covenant, with its strong emphasis on righteous leadership and moral integrity. These were not just alternative scriptures, they were mirrors held up to the soul of humanity. And in that reflection, people could see themselves as more than subjects of empire. They could see themselves as divine creations with purpose, history, and power. Such a vision did not serve the interests of colonial rulers or church hierarchies. It called people to a higher standard. It insisted that every human being, regardless of geography or skin color, was already included in the sacred story. And so, instead of engaging with these texts, Western theologians dismissed them as apocryphal, labeling them with terms that made them seem suspicious, even dangerous. But the real danger was never in the content, it was in the empowerment that content offered. For generations, millions of people grew up with a Bible that was edited for empire. It wasn't until scholars, historians, and spiritual seekers began to ask deeper questions that the broader world even learned about what had been excluded. But the Ethiopian church had never let go. Quietly, faithfully, they carried the weight of these scriptures, generation after generation, not to hoard them, but to protect them, not to separate themselves, but to keep the truth intact, until the world was ready to listen. And now, as more eyes open, as more hearts become curious, that truth is being revealed, not as a weapon of division, but as a bridge back to wholeness. Understanding why these texts were removed opens the door to understanding how belief systems have been shaped, not by God alone, but by human agendas. It invites people to question what else might have been altered or silenced in the name of control. And it calls us back to a place of deeper faith, one not limited by borders or power structures, but rooted in the full, rich, unfiltered history of divine revelation. When the Ethiopian Bible was set aside, so too was a part of our collective soul. But now that it is resurfacing, we have the chance to reclaim not just a book, but a birthright of spiritual power, truth, and self-understanding that was once taken, but never lost. The Ethiopian Bible is not just a book. It is a treasure chest of divine wisdom, layered with spiritual truth, historical depth, and sacred understanding that stretches far beyond what most of the world has ever known. While the standard Western Bible contains 66 books, the Ethiopian Bible includes more than 80, each carrying unique revelations that speak to the complexity and fullness of God's relationship with humanity. These texts were not added as an afterthought. They were preserved with purpose. They were read, memorized, taught, and honored in a culture that saw no need to simplify or dilute God's message for convenience or political uniformity. And in that difference lies one of the greatest untapped spiritual reservoirs in human history. Books like Enoch speak about things most people never hear in church: visions of heaven, celestial beings, and the rebellion of angels who descended to earth and altered human destiny. It's not just myth or mystery. It's a deeper look into the divine order, the battle between good and evil, and how spiritual forces interact with human lives. The wisdom of Enoch reveals that humanity has always been under the watchful eye of something greater, and that choices, both seen and unseen, carry eternal consequences. This book gives people a sense of spiritual urgency, not fear, but purpose. It's a reminder that our lives are not random, and that there's a divine structure far beyond human governments or institutions. Then there's the book of Jubilees, often referred to as the Little Genesis, which expands upon the stories we think we already know. It doesn't contradict the Bible, it completes it. Jubilees lays out divine timelines, moral laws, and generational lessons with clarity and depth. It gives a chronological framework to sacred events, helping readers understand that divine timing is never accidental. This book offers context to commandments, shows how early humanity was guided by spiritual law, and challenges us to live by principles that were written not on paper alone, but on the soul of the world. In a time when people are hungry for structure and guidance, Jubilees brings the kind of clarity that can only come from sacred wisdom rooted in ancient truth. And then we find the Book of the Covenant, an often overlooked but powerful compilation of spiritual instruction. It teaches not just obedience, but the heart behind the law. It speaks of justice, community, leadership, and reverence. It's not just a rule book, it's a blueprint for a holy life. In these pages, we see a God who cares not just about ritual, but about righteousness. A God who wants the widow protected, the stranger welcomed, and the leader held accountable. This kind of message disrupts systems built on hierarchy and oppression because it teaches that holiness is not about status, it's about service. It redefines greatness through humility and leadership through love. The Ethiopian Bible is not only older in composition, it's wider in spiritual scope. It tells stories of prophets, priests, and kings who don't always look like the portraits hanging in Western cathedrals. It places people of color, people of conviction, people of vision at the heart of sacred history. It teaches that faith was never a European invention, but a human inheritance, shared by all, shaped by many, and preserved by those strong enough to carry truth through centuries of silence and distortion. When these books were left out of Western versions of the Bible, it wasn't because they lacked truth, it was because they held too much of it. Too much wisdom, too much history, too much power for those who were never supposed to have it. These texts empower the forgotten, the silenced, and the dismissed. They declare to every person who's been told they were unworthy that they were always worthy. They say to every community whose voice was stripped away that their voice was sacred all along. In a world that thrives on division, these scriptures offer unity through truth. They remind us that we are part of a larger, older, deeper story, one that does not begin with conquest but with creation, not with exclusion but with invitation. Today, people are waking up to the fact that something was missing. They're searching for more than just sermons. They're searching for roots. The Ethiopian Bible provides those roots. It grounds the spiritual journey in a context that includes Africa, includes the marginalized, includes the mystery, and includes the majesty of a God too big to fit in a reduced canon. Rediscovering these texts isn't about rewriting history. It's about reclaiming it. It's about opening our eyes to a truth that was never lost, just locked away. And now, as more people turn to the pages of these ancient books, something powerful is happening. People are realizing that their faith isn't smaller than they imagine, it's larger. Their place in the story isn't on the sidelines, it's at the center. These scriptures remind us that spiritual truth is not the property of any one nation, race, or institution. It belongs to all who seek it with a sincere heart. And in the Ethiopian Bible, that truth is alive, waiting to be read, embraced, and lived. Because the wisdom hidden there is not just for Ethiopia, it is for the world. And the time has come for the world to listen. Despite centuries of dismissal and suppression, the Ethiopian scriptures continue to stand as a testament to the indestructible nature of spiritual truth. They were not preserved by accident, nor did they survive by chance. Their survival was the result of relentless devotion, tireless scholarship, and an unshakable belief in the sacred. In the highlands and monasteries of Ethiopia, monks carried scrolls across generations, not for wealth, not for power, but for the preservation of something eternal. When others erased, these guardians recorded. When others silenced, they sang. And when others buried the truth beneath layers of doctrine and control, they held it close, copying word by word, keeping alive stories that others hoped would be forgotten. The power in these texts didn't diminish with time. It deepened. While Western institutions codified their version of Scripture, often shaped by politics, conquest, and cultural dominance, the Ethiopian canon remained rooted in spiritual purpose. It was untouched by the hands of those who sought to edit divinity for convenience. This wasn't just an alternative version of the Bible. It was a bold witness to the fullness of God's message as it was passed down, unfiltered and unbroken. And although it was excluded from Western circles, it was never void of divine presence. That is the miracle of these scriptures. They may have been ignored by the world, but they were never abandoned by God. In the silence of those ancient chambers where monks transcribed holy words, there echoed a cry that defied centuries of erasure. The cry said, "We will not forget who we are." These sacred books affirmed the dignity of those who were told they had no place in the narrative of salvation. They declared that spiritual wisdom was not owned by the powerful, but entrusted to the faithful. And so, even when the Ethiopian canon was dismissed as apocryphal, it continued to live through tradition, through storytelling, through unbroken community ties that valued truth more than approval. This quiet resistance, this act of sacred remembrance, is why these scriptures endure today. They are not just literature. They are the legacy of a people who refused to bow to theological censorship. They are the heartbeat of a culture that saw divinity not as a possession to be controlled, but as a truth to be honored. Every preserved scroll is a monument to resilience. Every ancient hymn sung in J is a prayer that defied conquest. And every reader who opens these texts today steps into a stream of memory that was never extinguished, only hidden. What the world tried to suppress has now become a source of awakening. People are discovering that what was once branded irrelevant carries the very essence of the sacred. The stories within these texts speak to human struggle, divine justice, cosmic order, and enduring faith. They remind the reader that being ignored by history does not mean being erased by eternity. The Western world may have closed its doors to these scriptures, But truth has a way of finding its voice again. And now, as hearts and minds turn back toward what was cast aside, there is a rising understanding. Truth can be buried, but it cannot die. These Ethiopian texts challenge modern believers to ask deeper questions. They invite them to step beyond the boundaries of tradition and into the wide, untamed landscape of spiritual exploration. They are proof that spiritual identity does not rely on external validation. It thrives in the presence of inner conviction. What these scriptures carry is not just old knowledge, but living fire. And once someone encounters that fire, they can never again settle for a diluted version of their faith. This is not just about restoring forgotten books. It is about reclaiming forgotten voices. The prophets, the priests, the seers, the communities, the cultures that dared to preserve their truth when others tried to destroy it. In those erased voices, we find persistent truth. In that persistence, we find ourselves. And in that truth, we find God. For generations, people have walked through life unaware that an entire chapter of their spiritual and historical identity was sealed away, hidden behind walls built not by truth, but by fear. Fear of what it would mean if the world knew the full story. Rediscovering the Ethiopian Bible is more than a religious curiosity. It's a spiritual awakening. It's the opening of a door long kept shut, one that leads not only to deeper divine knowledge, but also to self-realization for people who were told for too long that they did not belong in the pages of sacred history. To discover these scriptures is to stand face to face with the truth that God did not forget them, that their heritage has always been part of the divine plan, and that no system, no church, no empire could erase what heaven had already sealed. When someone reads the ancient Ethiopian texts, especially those who have roots in Africa or belong to the African diaspora, something begins to shift. There's a recognition, a spiritual echo that says, you were always part of this. That message carries healing power. It's more than a fact, it's a restoration. These scriptures contain more than just commandments and parables. They hold a mirror up to those who have been historically marginalized and say, you are seen, you are sacred, you are significant. This sense of divine belonging challenges centuries of imposed inferiority. For people who were taught to look outward for spiritual validation, these texts help them look inward and realize that holiness already lived in their bloodline. That realization is transformative. It becomes fuel for the soul. It becomes the root of confidence that doesn't rely on approval or acceptance from those who once dictated worth. To know that your ancestors didn't just endure, but preserved the sacred, is to reclaim not only your history, but your power. This is not arrogance. It is alignment with truth. The rediscovery of these ancient books is not about proving superiority. It's about correcting the record. It's about saying, with boldness and grace, we were always there. We were not an afterthought. We were a foundation. This new understanding forces people to question the version of history they were taught. They begin to realize that omission was not accidental. It was intentional. But truth doesn't fade just because it's silenced. The Ethiopian Bible becomes a tool for unlearning the lie that only one culture carried divine knowledge. It reveals a broader, richer, more inclusive spiritual reality, one where African voices are not secondary, but central. These books empower a generation that has been spiritually starved to now eat from the full table of divine wisdom. They allow people to connect their identity to the eternal, to see that their culture was not just involved in God's story. It helped carry it. This empowerment is not just personal, it's collective. Families are awakening. Communities are awakening. A people scattered across the globe are slowly coming to realize that they are not orphans in the spiritual narrative. They are heirs, heirs to a story that spans continents, languages, and empires, but remains rooted in something unshakable. This truth doesn't just change how people see themselves. It changes how they live. It brings purpose. It brings direction. It brings strength. Because when someone knows where they come from, truly knows, they walk differently. They speak with conviction. They love themselves more deeply. They treat others with more honor. They no longer beg to be seen. They recognize that they have always mattered. And the most powerful result of this awakening is the refusal to be silent anymore. People are speaking up. They are questioning. They are searching. They are sharing what they find. This isn't about rebellion. It's about return. Return to truth. Return to wholeness. Return to the divine wisdom that was always within reach, but hidden beneath centuries of theological construction. Now the veil is lifting. And as it lifts, a generation is rising with it. A generation that refuses to be spiritually defined by what was left out. A generation that is learning to embrace what was always within them. The call to walk boldly in the fullness of their divine inheritance.